especially of Nuada, who was the keeper of the wisdom of the knowledge that was in the well of the wisdom of knowledge. That was confusing. Candlelit.ie. Welcome back to the Candlelit Tales YouTube channel. My name is Aron and I'm one sibling of the sibling duo that makes up Candlelit Tales. And in this video, I'm going to be explaining to you what I know about Angus Og, the Celtic god of love. Now, he seems to be an interesting character and I've certainly spent a lot of time looking at him, at his dwellings, at his spaces and places in between story, metaphor, myth, and whatever meaning we can derive from him, because he's not just the god of love, he's the young god. Og is young, possibly because he was 9 months younger than he should have been. He was the son of the Dagda and Boan. And they met when Boan was walking along the riverbank, hearing beautiful music coming from the Dagda, but she couldn't spend as long as she wanted to with the Dagda, who was playing his music on the magical harp Uv. And so the Dagda threw a spell onto the sun, and the sun stayed still for a year so that they could spend a bit more time together. After all, Boan was married to Nuada at the time, Nuada of the silver arm, and maybe he was a bit cold to touch. Either which way, they fell madly in love with each other, and they spent a whole year together. And in this time, Angus Og was conceived and born out of such pure love, the sun stood still for a year and a day. And when he was born, Boan ran up to the well of wisdom and peered within it against all ruling. But she stared inside the well and the water erupted and followed her all the way down to the coast, where some say she drowned, some say she turned into the river Boyne, which runs right around Brú na Boyne. This was the home that she wanted to give to her son. Now Angus, because he was born without that gestation period, he was known as Angus Og, the young god, the god of youth and young love as well as love, because he just seemed to be a child that everyone was in love with around him. He was fostered to Midir and Fumnock. Fosterage in Ireland was a very big thing, and every hero would be able to trace their lineage of fosterage as well as their direct descendants. And so you have an interesting link with Midir and Fumnock. These were two of the Danann. They were not as powerful maybe as the Dagda, the good god, the great god that he was. But Midir and Fumnock, as far as I can see, were not in a very loving relationship. Perhaps it was functional. They were diligent and they were able to take care of their land and their home and their surroundings until Angus got there. Angus Og, I think, was just somebody that you couldn't help but be a little bit in love with and in good humour around. He was just one of those. And Midir and Fumnock, they managed to, nurture and cherish this lovely child as he grew and grew and grew. But when Angus left, then Fumnock Midir, again reading between the lines, went back to being a functional relationship. The love of Angus not being there perhaps instigated a little bit of separation anxiety between the pair, and the two of them were no longer madly in love with being around one another perhaps. Either which way, Midir decided to visit Angus when he lived in the Brú. I'll get to how he got that though, because as with all of these stories, the timelines don't always sync up. It doesn't always make sense. How young was he exactly? Or how old? But he was living in Newgrange, Brú na Boyne, and Midir went to visit, and he met a Thane along the road. And as soon as Angus heard this, he was delighted. He wanted them to be in love, to find love, young love, lustful, longing, connection, all of the good stuff. This made Angus delighted, and Midir thought it would be perfectly fine to bring his new lover back to his wife. There were second wives, second husbands, third husbands, sometimes in Celtic tradition. It was okay to marry multiple people. It was totally polyamorous in a way, as long as it was agreed upon beforehand. You didn't just arrive with a new partner to your previous and say, by the way, she's here now. Or maybe you did if you were Medea and you thought you'd get away with it. He did not. He found a very resentful, very jealous, very scornful and rejected, presumably, Fumnach, who absolutely hated the sight of Athene. The fact that she sang, the fact that she was younger and more beautiful, and Medea doted over her. So, being one of the Tuatha and having an all-powerful ability to cast spells and transform, shapeshift, and do mystical things, she cast a spell on Medea, a jealous, hateful spell, which turned her into a fly. Some people will say butterfly, just because they're pretty, and they like the idea of Athene being a butterfly. Pretty sure it's a fly, if you go back to the old translations, and I can see some buzzing around here. It's kind of funny. So, with whether you want her to be a butterfly or a fly, she was certainly turned into an insect. And she stayed around. Athene flew around in the form of a fly or butterfly, and she flew around and she still was able to create music, and so she still managed to convey a meaning to Medea, who still wanted her to be near him, and he went for walks, he talked to her, he told her stories, she hovered around, he was besotted with her still. So it wasn't just a love of infatuation and lust and longing, it was something deeper, and Fumnach raged even more to see this. So she drew up a huge spell and blasted it at Athene, which blew her all over the country, and that's where Angus comes back in. Angus must have heard her somehow, brought her into the Brún na Báine, managed to shelter Athene as this insect form, sent a message to Medea, and well, he managed to come down and visit her. And once more, with Angus's care and attention and affection and nurturing of this love, well, they managed to communicate and keep the love between the two, until Fumnach's storms raged on and on and on and pushed Athene into the winds of time. And unfortunately, well, for those of you who know the end of this story, there's a few ends, but Angus steps away from that narrative. Medea spends basically lifetimes waiting to meet Athene again, and eventually does. He finds out she's been reborn after a queen drank the fly into her belly, gave birth to another Athene because she wanted to call her that for some reason. And Medea seeks her out and finds her and brings her back to the other world. If you want to end it there, there's a whole other thing that we don't have to go into because this video is about Angus Og, not Medea and Athene. But if you want to listen to Medea and Athene, go check the video about Medea and Athene. We have it on our podcast, along with nearly 300 episodes, coming up to 300. It's a lot of episodes. So, considering this is about Angus Og, what did Angus Og do after this episode with Medea and Athene? You might think he's just a god of love, of nurturing, of connection, of youth and beauty. He went and he found Fumnach. And he showed a very, very vicious side to love, or protective love, father-son, foster father-son relationship. He was furious at Fumnach. He took out a sword and he beheaded the woman who had turned Athene into a fly and banished her into the winds of time. Pretty gnarly, pretty on Cupid-like. Is he Eros? Is he something like these other gods of love? Or is he a little bit more Celtic? Is he a little bit more Irish? And is he a little bit more grit in his teeth? You could argue other gods of different pantheons have similar reactions, but it sets him apart in my mind. Again, the two of the Danann were neither good nor bad, nor one thing or the other. Yes, he was a god of love, but he also chopped someone's head off, as a great warrior will do when he sees injustice. And I've heard some very interesting perspectives given voice to from Karina Tynan, who has written a number of books, but specifically one with the story of Fumnach, which I heard live, and it was amazing to listen to somebody putting voice to somebody who was so betrayed and so angry and justified in her rage. Either which way, Angus Og decided to chop her head off. And he was a bit of a trickster. He's not always just doing lovely things. He had his mother, Boan, and his father, Dagda. He wanted to live in the Brún na Báine, the palace, the brilliant kingdom of the Báine, this mansion rather, surrounded by the Báine, now that it flowed all around. His mother, Angus Og's own birth mother, was now a river goddess, and so he wanted to live there. However, Elkmar lived there. Who's Elkmar? Also was married to Boan. Anyway, Elkamar lived in the Brew, modern day Newgrange, which is a very famous archaeological site in Ireland. And the mythology of this place was that Angus Og went and asked Elkamar if he could just stay there for a day and a night, you know, look at his mom flowing by there in the river and just hang out for a little bit, because that'd be nice, wouldn't it? And Elkamar, being, you know, having a connection to Angus's mother, of course, he said, yes, that's totally fine. But he left for a day and a night, and he came back the following day, and Angus seemed to have set up shop. He was not leaving. He seemed very, very comfortable. And when Elkamar asked him when he was going to leave, Angus Og said, what are you talking about? You gave me Brew in the Boyne, the mansion on the Boyne. What do you mean? How am I getting out of this palace? Now, Elkamar was furious, as you would be. He went to the Dagda, which, you know, wasn't a great call, because the Dagda was Angus's own father, so maybe there was a little bit of inside job going on here, and asked for a fair trial. You know, he wanted the eviction to be enforced. He wanted to go back home. The Dagda gave him the ruling that a day and a night is all passage of time. It represents all time, because there's always a day followed by a night, and all we're ever present for is the moment that we're in anyway. And so if you give someone something for a day and a night, that's all there will ever be, a day and a night, followed by a day and a night. Cyclical as that logic might be, and circular in format of thinking, but, well, it gave Angus Og his home at the Brew. And that's where he stayed for as long as we can tell. Maybe he's still there in some way. It was his duty to bring the beloved dead from the resting place through the veil into the other world. And so he was a very, very respected and loved and adored god for doing so. So when anyone left this mortal realm, Angus would be their guide across to the other world. And of course, that makes him a god of love. When it comes to the love that we understand as reckless and careless and joyous and tumultuous and desperation and chaos, there hasn't been much of that in his story so far. He just seems to be a lovely fella, watching love go around with his foster father and his new fling. But there was never many mentions of his love affairs. Maybe he was just very lovely. I like to think personally that he was a guy who just slept around and didn't really feel any issues, and it wasn't a problem for him, and he never really felt that real heartache or tug, because everybody seemed lovely and everyone was lovely to him. Until the dream of Angus Og, also known as the story of Care and Angus. And in this dream, Angus is visited each night by a woman that is beyond compare in beauty and presence and music. And she stands there playing the harp, and Angus can't talk to her. He doesn't know her name, he doesn't know where she came from, but he's enamored by her in this dream, and she simply comes and plays music. Even though he couldn't touch her or talk to her, he wished his days away. He didn't want anyone else for company, and then he hoped that he would see her in his dreams when he closed his eyes. And so for a whole year he spends his time like not really interacting in the real world and going back to bed to be with his beloved in the dreamscape, until she stops coming. And suddenly Angus Og is heartbroken to be without this beautiful woman in his presence, and also takes to bed in the hope that she will just return. But the time goes by and he's not getting better, and well, the Dagda is worried about him, and he sends for all of the healers, all the messengers, to find out what's going on with his son. The Inkect is called for, the physician of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the wise healer that he is, realizes that this is no normal sickness. This is a sickness of the heart. And so the Dagda finds out exactly who this woman was by the description Angus eventually gives him. And she was the daughter of Bov Darragh. And this is where it gets interesting. Some versions have a telling where a druid placed the spell upon Care for not giving him the love he desired from her. And the spell was that she would be locked physically to Loch Buel Dragoon, the lake of the dragon mouth, and spend 1 year in the shape of a swan and 1 year back in her human form, but always at Loch Buel Dragoon, until she could fly as a swan. So it's not great escapism, but she'd have to come back. And some versions, which I particularly quite like, and a friend of ours, Angel Hannigan, shout out to her, found this when she was researching the story, that it was, and maybe it's a reimagining of an older text, but I also like this. that it was Cair's desire to be away from the basically men coming on to her and offering her big things and rings and lovely things. Well, all of the suitors and all of the requests for her love just drove her insane. And so she took herself away and she fastened herself to Lochbuel Dragoon, the lake of the dragon mouth, and placed a curse on her and her 50 handmaidens. Don't be forgetting the 50 handmaidens, because she was the daughter of a king, both Darragh and Munster. It was a pretty big deal. So she had 50 handmaidens. And when they had the curse upon them, well, they couldn't leave. So Angus Og found out whether it was a curse placed on her or whether it was a curse she placed on herself. She was pretty cursed and she could not leave other than being in the form of a swan. So what was Angus going to do? I like to think, and once again, reading between the lines, he went and asked as many people as he could. He went and found out as much as he could. He had to learn about love from the opposite end. He looked and he asked and he found maybe there was magical potions that could help him. Maybe there was incantations. There was herbs. There was things that brought him back down to Lochbuel Dragoon. And when he found his space there, there was a load of swans flying around, led by one with a golden chain on her throat. Might have forgot to mention that Cair was wearing a golden chain around her throat. And in the shape of a swan, all of the swans landed in Lochbuel Dragoon and then changed back into their human form. On the water, Angus Og walked towards her. Not exactly sure what they said to each other. Something like, "This was pretty hard to find." Or maybe, "You could have come faster, you gobshite. What took you so long?" Angus cast a spell. And this is one of those lovely stories that reverses expectations because he changed himself into the form of a swan to match her swan form. And then they flew off high into the sky and circled over Lochbuel Dragoon and back to the brew, where they might be still today. This is the one and only happy love story. And I also used to introduce this fairly confident that it was a happy love story until someone said to me, "Really? I mean, they have to change it to swans. It's not really a very happy love story, is it?" I think it's romantic. And I think it represents this idea of not expecting, not demanding, not possessing love, of it being something that you have to change to accept or to be accepted within. There's a lot of metaphor in these things, and I'm always interested in what they mean to people rather than prescribing a meaning. I hate when people do that. Don't you tell me what to feel. But there's a lot of feeling in Angus. And I personally have gone back to Angus when I'm in tumultuous times and gone, "What am I doing here, buddy?" Look at the River Boyne and wondering what's going on. But I think he offers strength in the stability of knowing that love is that thing that's in every culture, every mythology, every single nation has love as a thing that binds them. And it is transformative. It goes through layers of meaning. It does not need voice or words to describe, although I'm doing my best to waffle on about it, possibly too much. It's one of those things that we as humans can't do without. You just can't. And so we need gods to represent the ideal. I think Angus represents that really well in the fact that he loves somebody outside of himself so much that he's willing to sacrifice his entire literal physical form for her and to match state and her being, her place and her own transformation. So, of course, stories about Angus Og and love, you can't forget Diarmid O'Divna. Angus would have stood behind or beside some heroes. Specifically, Diarmid is one of the best known ones. There were a few others that I looked up that I didn't recognise, so I won't try and pronounce the names because they were long and I didn't recognise them. And names are hard sometimes and they're embarrassing to say wrong. So, but Diarmid de Gwine, which I was saying wrong. I have been saying wrong a few times. Diarmid de Gwine from Kirkagwine. That's how we realised we were saying that name wrong. He was a ferocious, brilliant warrior of the Fianna up until he betrayed Fionn McCool running off with Grania, the famous tale of the pursuit of Diarmid and Grania. This is currently being told on our podcast right now in a mini-series within the Fianna saga. And so we had a lot of time in looking this up. And Angus Og is beautifully depicted as somebody who just comes in to help them out every now and again. And Angus Og came in with some great advice for Diarmid and Grania because he needed them to stay alive. There was such potential for this love. Angus Og recognised that this was an epic love story and he wanted to save the young lovers from the pursuit of Fionn McCool and the rest of the Fianna. And so he told Diarmid not to be stopping, not to be slowing down, not to enter a house without 7 doors or at least another door, to not eat where they cook, not sleep where they eat, and never to rise where they lay down the night before. So always be on the move, to be cooking and eating someone over there, to be going down to rest here, getting up halfway through the night and moving on somewhere else, I think is what that means. Whenever he doesn't do that and challenges or comes up against the Fianna, Angus Og jumps in and spirits Grania away, while usually Diarmid ends up in some form of fight, tussle, and leaping or running away to meet Grania with Angus Og. He had an invisibility cloak, which I also love, because Boann, it's the first mention of an invisibility cloak. It was Boann who used it to shelter her hurt from the lack of love of Nuada until she met the Dagda, and then we have this sign of her son having the invisibility cloak, and he uses it again to shelter Diarmid and Grania, or perhaps just Grania at times. And so it's interesting that the god born from love also had this ability to hide away and shelter and not be seen. So there's definitely a deeper meaning in there somewhere. I haven't quite teased it out yet, but it might be straight on the face, as obvious as it sounds. This expansive, beautiful, recognizable, vulnerable love needs to recharge and hide away sometimes too. Maybe that's a lesson. I'm not sure. That's what it kind of means to me. But Angus Og could mean anything to a lot of different people. And when there are dogs barking in the background, we are reminded of the different animals that come into mythology that are loyal and loving and caring. There are many hounds in the Fianna. There are many beautiful tales of love and loss and strife. And well, Angus has been part of a few of them. I'm just kind of curious if you guys know any stories I didn't mention or any facts about Angus that are different to what I've mentioned here. I went on a bit of a deep dive to try and research this after years of telling his stories, and it's been great to recognize that there was some details I didn't know. So there's always stuff I don't know, and I'm absolutely no expert scholar on this. I love these stories. We love these stories. Myself and my sister, we have this channel so we can dive deeper into these stories and share them with you and find out what you want us to talk about and what is powerful for these stories for you. What does the god of love in Celtic mythology mean to you? Transformation into a swan or otherwise? Does it jump out to you as, I'll leave it alone, or I want to investigate this guy a bit more? Let us know in the comments below if you'd like us to deep dive anything else. Seeing as it is the month of love, we decided to put this out, even though, I don't know, it doesn't have anything to do with Celtic tradition specifically to be celebrating love, because that's a year-long thing. You're supposed to be doing it all the time. Maybe, I don't know. Let us know if you have any more suggestions for deep divers, explainer videos, and thank you so much for listening. Let us know if you had any questions, and we'll see you next time on the Candlelit Tales YouTube channel.